Good evening. Welcome to this first episode of Catholicism Around the Movies, a new initiative of the American Catholic Historical Association. My name is Anthony B. Smith. I'm an associate professor of religious studies at the University of Dayton and the president of the ACHA. Want to welcome everybody, particularly people who might be dropping in, who may not be members, but have decided to kind of drop in to find out what this is about. Welcome, and I hope you stay around. Tonight, we inaugurate a forum intended to give a little more visibility to Catholic studies and film, a platform and an arena to explore where film and Catholic studies are and where perhaps they may be headed. This venture is intended to be wide-ranging, open, and collaborative, attracted to and desirous of more rather than less, too much instead of too little, concerned with connections rather than lines of demarcation and disciplinary purity. Catholicism and cinema have a long, entwined, and complicated history stretching back to the earliest days of the medium. I won't go into that history. Some of you are familiar with that. Only to say, just when one thinks one might be done with Catholicism and film, the movies bring you back in. I once wondered several years ago where cinema and Catholics might go next, and then we get these new articulations of Catholic horror. So the crossroads of Catholicism and movies, therefore, seem to be a continuously generative cultural space. Perhaps that's because there's a stickiness between Catholicism and movies, given the visual nature of both, or perhaps because there's just a lot of Catholics around the world. So film and global cinema and its recordings and reflecting and mediating the world around it can help at times, but encounter and make use of Catholics and Catholicism. Or perhaps it's because Catholicism provides a useful, recognizable way to register discontents with modernity, given how cinema became perhaps the paradigmatic medium of the modern age. In other words, movies and Catholicism can't help but get on with each other, even if they haven't always gotten along with each other. Desire and aggression, it seems, are woven into the relationships between Catholics, Catholicism, and cinema. So Catholicism Around the Movies is intended less as an intervention and more as an invitation to sustain conversation and perhaps expand the parameters of the discourse around and within Catholicism and film. Some of us focus on film and its Catholic hauntings. Others attend to particular dimensions or eras of Catholicism in their work. And most likely, many more people don't focus on film, but find movies useful in their courses on the history of Catholicism or courses in Catholic studies. The aim here is to facilitate a dialogue of the many ways into and around film and the study of Catholicism. Toward that end tonight, and turning to the movie in question, St. Maud from 2019, we have much to talk about. I'm here with two great colleagues and friends to help us think about this movie, Kathleen Holscher and Matthew J. Cressler. Kathleen Holscher is Associate Professor of Religious Studies and American Studies and holds the endowed chair of Roman Catholic Studies at the University of New Mexico. She is the author of Religious Lessons, Catholic Sisters, and the Law in Mid-Century New Mexico. Her recent work on Catholic clerical sexual abuse includes Desolate Country, an interactive digital mapping project she created with Dr. Jack Downey. She's currently co-writing Body and Blood, Catholic Horror in America with Downey, Matt Cressler, and Mike Pesquet. It's going to be dynamite. She's also past president of the American Catholic Historical Association. Matthew J. Cressler is an independent scholar of religion and chief of staff of the Corporation for Public Interest Technology. He's the author of Authentically Black and Truly Catholic, The Rise of Black Catholicism in the Great Migrations, and creator of Bad Catholics, Good Trouble, an educational web comic series. He's published on Catholic horror in The Atlantic, The Revealer, and U.S. Catholic, and he's currently co-writing Body and Blood with Jack Downey, Katie Holscher, and Mike Pesquet. We're hoping that tonight can be a wide-ranging conversation where lots of people have come to share their thoughts about St. Maud. And so please encourage you to kind of ask questions and raise comments in the chat and in the Q&A section. Let me start off by offering a few brief observations about St. Maud before we hear from Katie and Matt. One consideration is how the film raises questions about Catholicism, cultural history, and film genre. Whether at particular historical moments, certain specific popular culture forms prove particularly attractive or useful as vehicles for articulating Catholic anxieties, desires, and contradictions. Now, this is not to suggest that any genre is distinctly or uniquely or essentially Catholic. Genres themselves are historical constructs, really always already hybrids themselves. There's no pure genre. Instead, it's to ask whether specific genres might at particular historical times function to focus certain preoccupations with or about what we might identify as Catholic, and to wonder about the role that genres themselves play in giving public expression to historical Catholicism. So, for instance, one can think of the gangster films of the 1970s, the Godfather movies and Mean Streets, as particularly creative vehicles for articulating certain complicated feelings towards an older ethnic Catholic world of the 20th century, and how those feelings helped motivate and inform films that both captured people's attention and helped shape 70s cinema. And that raises another question about how the inner lives of Catholics and their cultural forms are engines of wider popular culture. So likewise, horror, as Katie and Matt and Jack Downey and others have written, seems a particularly relevant genre for exploring the abuses and horrors of Catholicism in our own moment. So where does St. Maud fit into here? Secondly, a cluster of Catholic preoccupations informs St. Maud's horror that reflect or echo recent interests in the historical study of Catholicism. The presence of Catholic gods, to use Robert Orsi's terms, and the disturbing vulnerability they engender for their devout, as well as the darker dimensions of Catholic religious devotion are on display. In the character of Maud, we're encouraged to wonder when or whether devotional self-sacrifice become actual self-annihilation. We can see, too, a rendering of Catholicism in caregiving. Catholic care and the ministries of caretaking, whether formal or not, constitute a major part of Catholic history and a large part of the history of Catholic women. This movie gives particularly compelling dramatization to such gendered histories and practices. And then finally, there's St. Maud, the film St. Maud in relation to other movies and to film history with its numerous cinematic references, to horror films such as The Exorcist, of course, but also to The Shining and to other movies as well. I'm thinking in particular of Billy Wilder's great 1950 movie, Sunset Boulevard, that this St. Maud seems to particularly have on its mind. And that's how those films serve as additional contexts for this movie's articulation of Catholicism. So those are just some initial thoughts. And now I'm going to turn it over first to Matt and then to Katie. Take it away, guys.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tony. And thanks everybody for being here. Nice to see friends in the crowd. And just want to, again, reiterate that the dream is that this conversation will be conversational and free flowing and kind of informal. So, I would suggest, rather than do the thing where you like wait to the end to like post a question in the Q&A section or like to hit up the chat, like be active, chat, participants, be active in the Q&A session. And after Katie and I and perhaps Tony engage in some conversation, we want to get your not just questions, but thoughts and reflections, because this is a film, if you did the homework and you watch the movie, like there are so many different ways in which you could read the film, so many questions that the film raises for us. As you said, Tony, like both as like scholars of Catholics and also just like as film lovers. Yeah, so yeah, just like really, really excited to be here with everybody. This will be your first, last, and only spoiler warning, I guess. We're kind of just going to operate with the assumption that you've either seen the movie or you're cool knowing what the movie is about and what happens. But we thought we would start with a trailer, just because the trailer is really evocative of the atmosphere of the film. And then Katie will kind of give us a kind of synopsis before we jump into some questions. And apology, I'm kind of serving as panelist and kind of IT. So apologies if the sound quality is a little wonky, but here we go. Let's see a little bit of St. Maud.
Dear God, your presence graces the air And soon, everyone will see.
Hi, you Maud?
Yes, hi. It takes nothing special to mop up after the dying.
You're prettier than the last one.
But to save a soul, that's quite something. Bless Amanda's body, and bless her mind, which is shrouded in darkness.
When you pray, do you get a response?
Oh, it's like he's physically in me. It's how he guides me.
My little savior.
Hey, I thought that was you. What you up to? I'm a private carer.
You're still nursing?
What?
They know what happened.
All the good girls go to hell. 'Cause even God herself.
I just want to see you loosen up.
I've got more important things on my mind.
There's my little saint. Maud, he isn't real.
Nothing worthwhile comes easily.
All the good girls go to hell. I turn to ignore you. Don't say I didn't warn you.
You must be the loneliest girl I've ever seen.
I'm ready and open. I feel fuller of your love than ever before.
I have a responsibility.
Oh, yes, of course.
This is life and death on another level.
What if I'm getting it all wrong?
All the good girls go to hell.
Let's go. Oh wait, I gotta turn off my
She's mine.
I'm playing the next, it's automatically playing the next video. Sorry about that. All right, Katie.
All right. All right. My little synopsis. Really excited to talk about Saint Maud. Cressler and I, we watched it together again. What was it, like 4 days ago or something? And I was reminded how much I like this movie. Saint Maud, Rose Glass, director, 2019 release. Set in the seaside town in England, Saint Maud introduces us to a pale and prim 20-something-year-old nurse, Maud, who's played by Morfydd Clark. Maud is hired to provide palliative care to Amanda, a former dancer who's middle-aged and dying of stage 4 cancer. Maud talks to God regularly, and she feels his presence in some pretty intense ways. He's physically in me or around me, she tells her new client. As Amanda stares down death alone in her lavish home, Maud sees an opportunity to share God's fullness with her. May God bless you and never waste your pain is Maud's refrain throughout the movie. Initially, Amanda appears receptive, and the two women share a Godgasm, as Cressler likes to call it, on the living room floor. But before long, it's clear that Amanda's displays of piety are a show, put on to distract herself from the dullness, as she puts it, of dying. The Body is a Stage is a book title in her library, and kind of announces this to us. In other words, Maud's efforts to convert Amanda are rebuffed. Maud retreats in humiliation, but when she's feeling her lowest in her tiny apartment with its makeshift altar, God speaks to her in his strange language, which turns out to be Welsh. And so Maud returns to Amanda, quote, fuller of his love than ever before, and this time with turned up thumbtacks in her shoes. I'm here, Amanda. I'm not alone, and neither are you. And keeping the full details of the spoilers maybe for a little later in our conversation, it'll suffice to say here that with God's presence pulsing through Maud, Amanda's continued stubbornness, he isn't real, you must know that, she tells Maud, her stubbornness provokes the nurse to get stabby. And in the end, Maud goes down to the beach and transforms herself into a real spectacle. She doesn't waste her pain, or does she? There you go.
Yeah, here we are.
And I wanted to, actually, I also wanted to get to read a quick piece. Shout out to Christina Pasqua and her 2022 piece in The Revealer on St. Maud, which has been really helpful to both Cressler and myself. I just want to read just a really short quote from it that I think helps us think about the film. So Christina writes, quote, "Depending on how you interpret it, St. Maud can be a hagiography gone wrong, a profile of a hospice nurse intent on saving a soul, or a detailed account of a slow descent into psychosis," right? And I love, one of my favorite parts of the movie is the way it tacks between these different possibilities. Nonetheless, Christina writes, "It shows us that for some people, God is real, a presence felt and experienced, a voice made audible, a presence that can feel really good, but can also cause people to do pretty horrific things like self-inflicted harm and violence against others."
Yeah, man. I mean, where do we go? Where do we begin? I mean, I think that what Christina's that quote and Christina's great essay like point to, and what kind of reviewing some of the reviews of the film indicated, is that like this is a film that, I mean, I don't know, it kind of like weirdly like at the very end tells you what it's about, some seemingly, but also resists interpretation. I think it can be so many things. And so I wanted to start off with an intentionally provocative, I feel like all of the questions that we crafted, Katie, are like different versions of like, what is this movie actually? Like, or what is this movie trying to do actually? But I wanted to start off with a kind of intentionally provocative question for a conversation that Tony has invited us into on Catholic horror, which, to put it bluntly, would be, is this a Catholic horror movie? Or like, is this a horror movie even? Rose Glass, in some of her interviews, kind of coyly said, I mean, she's like literally quoted as saying, even with St. Maud, I'm like, is this a horror movie? Of course, A24 marketed as like the next Hereditary and the next Midsommar and the next Witch. So they like very much see it as part of their kind of prestige horror brand, for lack of a better term. But I wanted to kind of start with that, like, is it a Catholic horror movie? Not as a way of saying that it isn't one, but rather to like invite a conversation about like, how is this film in conversation with Catholic horror as a subgenre, horror as a subgenre? Does it subvert the tropes of that genre? Does it embrace them? What do we think about that?
You want me to give a stab?
Take a shot.
Take a stab.
You're co-writing a book on it, so
Well, so obviously it very, very explicitly and self-consciously references The Exorcist, right? When Cressler and I rewatched it a few days ago, I was like actually blown away about how specifically it references The Exorcist, right? So there's the scene where Maud comes and approaches Amanda on what we know now as Amanda's deathbed, right? And I guess now we're just giving away everything, right? But once Amanda rebuffs her and says, God's not real, Maud, God's not real, you're alone, right? For Maud, Amanda turns into the devil, right? And there's this she's possessed by the devil, she's possessed by a demon, and there's a whole exorcist kind of like scenario, which then causes Maud to stab her to death, right? So it's very self-consciously referencing The Exorcist. What's interesting about Maud, though, Cressler and I and others have talked a lot about how in The Exorcist the supernatural is really real, right? And it's the realness of the supernatural that drives The Exorcist. And here it's more complicated, right? Here it's more complicated because, and I think Christina talks about this in her quote and in her essay, the supernatural is really real for Maud.
Right.
Right. It's really real for Maud, but Glass does that thing where she kind of tacks back and forth. So we see how real it is for Maud, but then we kind of get these moments of critical, or maybe you call it secular distance, where we say, oh, but wait, isn't this psychosis, right? wait,
Mhm.
isn't this actually something else?
And just to pick up on that, I mean, the ways that, you can see the color, tone, and gradations change from scene to scene when, we're kind of moving in and out of her, Maud's reality versus a different diegetic reality within the film, right? So you see that at the beach, right? When she first arrives on the beach, but then we see, right, her reality of the beach with the swirling clouds and everything like that, or earlier in the movie, in the kitchen, with Clara, right? Where she kind of
Oh, Carol, the escort of
yeah,
yeah.
right. And she's like, what the hell? Which, by the way, I mean, like, just like, what is this movie is a good question. Some of it is very funny, right? I mean,
Yeah.
like, in that scene in the kitchen where Maud is
Yeah.
kind of accosting Kara, right? And Kara's reaction is like, what the hell are you doing? Right? It's a very kind of funny scene where even, yeah. So there's a kind of humor in this thing too, right?
There is, yeah, and actually that was one of the it's funny because as a lover of The Exorcist and Catholic horror, I think that the first time I saw it, I was really captivated by the kind of atmospheric, eerie vibes of the film that I think is kind of quite similar to and certainly modeled in part off The Exorcist, this kind of like slow building tension that kind of only kind of culminates in the last 15-20 minutes of the film. But yeah, the second time I viewed it, the humor of it, and the humor that I think comes from the dissonance, I mean, to the point that you and Katie both raised, that the film is kind of constructed in this dissonance where you're kind of you're in Maud's perspective, you're kind of seeing the world from her perspective, but you can see on the edges the kind of contrasts with the kind of perspective of others in the world around her. Which I think for me is, I mean, to kind of build a little bit on what you were saying, Katie, about, the Catholic horror of it all, like that is where the film really, I think, subverts the kind of standard formula for me of what a Catholic horror movie is. I mean, starting with The Exorcist, but then with the like dozens and dozens of films, possession films, priests exorcising X, Y, or Z films that have come since. The kind of argument that all of those films pretty much make is, yeah, it's not psychosis. It's not that your like house is rickety. Like the devil is here. Like you gotta get the devil out. Like the devil is real, God is real, and you've got to choose a side, and you've got to choose one quick, or you're gonna die and be lost forever. And this movie is what really grabbed me about it the first time I saw it is it's like it's drawing deeply on the aesthetics of Friedkin's Exorcist and of other kind of Catholic horror movies, kind of like long, dark, and just horror movies generally, like long, dark hallways, flickering lights, really great, unsettling sound design. All of that stuff, like cuts to scary images, but doing so to make the opposite argument, it seems to me. I guess.
Okay, well,
but maybe we go, is this where we should jump to the end and be like, what is the argument that the film is trying to make?
So let me pose this as a question back to you, Cressler, right? Okay, so the end, right? I mean, I hope everyone has watched the movie.
Set up the end. Yeah, set up the ending.
This is like maybe my favorite scene in any movie I can think of from the last 5 years. I love it so much, right? So she walks down to the beach and she's almost levitating. She almost floats down to the beach and she's wearing like a bed sheet that's like turned into this beautiful, like pale pink robe. And then she pours, what does she pour? Gasoline? Acetone on herself, right? And she has the lighter, which hasn't worked the entire movie, but suddenly sparks a flame and she ignites herself and the sky is swirling and everyone on the beach, all the bystanders all fall to their knees, right? All fall to their knees as she's engulfed in flames. But then right, there's a very short last cut.
Then what happened? It
shows her, just this amazing thing. And then there's a very short last cut, which shows her her charred flesh, right?
Yeah.
So my question is, Cressler, right? My question is, what if they came out with a director's cut that got rid of that last 2-second shot that showed her charred flesh, right? Would it still be, would secular distance still take the day, right?
Yeah, I think that that last scene, I mean, it's funny because you call it, you know, we talk about it as like the last scene. It's like literally the last shot. It like takes maybe a second.
Right.
It's your charred body.
It's just
and
like
screams.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would it still, I think that we would be left in ambivalence if we didn't have that. I think it's hard to, you know, imagine the film without it, because it seems like the clearest statement from Glass about what she thinks is going on in the movie. But yeah, I mean, it does such distancing. So it's kind of an interesting thing because like the film, I think, really invites you to see the world as Maud sees it, which is like a really disturbing exercise for someone who like has the kind of view of the world that she does and is doing to herself and to others what she does. That's what the film really invites you to do for almost all of it. And then like the very last second kind of enforces this distance. I think that if without that last cut, it's a film where you leave, I mean, like, you know, the end of Inception, like, is it a dream or is it not a dream? Like, you know, you kind of leave the film without that last image, asking yourself, what are we to make of this? Tony, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I just want to jump in here for a minute. We got a couple questions, right, from people. So Adriana asks, I was struck by the luxurious sound production, right, which borders on fetishization. How does that quality, which is focused on viewers' experiences, fit into the Catholic horror genre? That's a really good question. You guys have thoughts about that?
Cressler, you have thoughts?
I mean, I have thoughts about the luxurious sound production. Adrienne I mean, that is the best way to describe it. Like and I was, even in the trailer, it captures it, like the squish when her foot goes into the nails.
Right.
It's like in the trailer. But I hadn't thought about it on bordering on fetishization and like how that fits into what we're thinking about when we're thinking about Catholic horror. I mean, if we think about the Catholic bit about Catholic horror here in this film, kind of like very much embodied by a kind of non-institutional kind of parachurch Catholicism that is like about her kind of sensual experience at her altar and in like sensual, literally and metaphorically, right, relationship with God. That I think the sound production is kind of essential to having us get immersed in that experience. It kind of like it shows and lets us hear rather than like telling us through dialogue like what it's like to be experiencing the world through Maud's perspective. Katie, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, only that I think like The Exorcist, I mean, there's also a kind of like invocation of the Gothic too in Maud. I mean, I think that that house is a very Gothic house, like in some ways. And I don't know. I also related to sound. Cressler and I were talking about this the other day, right? But so interesting the way in which God speaks to her in Welsh,
right?
Because there's no other marker to like help us situate that. There's no help. We don't get anything to situate that in the entire movie, right? But when he speaks to her in Welsh, it's like a stand-in for Latin, right? It's a stand-in for Latin, and it's a sort of stand-in for some sort of like old Catholicism, but it's not church Catholicism, right? Because church Catholicism would be Latin. So
I wonder if that's play, and I don't know whether the use of Welsh would play a little differently, in England, right? I mean, so if that signifies something in addition.
Yeah, I don't know. I know the actress is Welsh, but yeah. So there's another question that I think connects to this conversation about how we read the film from Chris Gomer, who's a dear friend. So he's asking, kind of in addition to that last image and the sound, do the wings that are drawn on in her vision also suggest the secular? Because, and I don't think that I'd ever picked up on this, but she's drawn them from those William Blake illustrations in the book that was given to her. So they're not like kind of real wings, whatever that means. They're kind of like her kind of taking them from the William Blake paintings that she was seeing. But I mean, I think I don't think we're done wrestling with this kind of like secular, however we want to describe the ending. Like, do we think that this is a kind of film that is kind of playing with the tropes of Catholic horror, but ultimately kind of giving like kind of like secular critique of it by like distancing itself from it and saying like, hey, there's nobody there, Maud. Like, you're all alone. None of it matters. Like, what do you think?
It reminds me, this is one before I forget. You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of the last scene in Psycho. So Psycho, we've been talking a lot about Psycho as a Catholic film, and we're working on this book, right? And there's that last scene in Psycho where they have to go to a psychiatrist's office, right? And then the psychiatrist literally like lectures the audience on like what was really wrong with Norman, right? Which was that Norman wasn't actually hearing his mother speak, right? Norman was actually had this like thing going on in his head, right? And Roger Ebert wrote this review of Psycho where he's like, Psycho would have been a perfect movie if it weren't for like that last scene where Hitchcock felt the need to sort of like check the box and say, okay, this is actually about psychosis. Right? That then forecloses these other possibilities in terms of like how you can think about Psycho, right? And I think that last little cut in Saint Maud is kind of doing something similar.
Yeah, I agree. Also, I want to throw this in. So I agree. Like I also the kind of like hesitation I have is like, I agree that ending is very much like the ending of Psycho, and that both of them serve to kind of like, okay, you've been on this weird, crazy journey, but like, I'm gonna like ground you back in the real world where like we understand how things actually work, and like we can see that Maud is kind of crazy, or we can see that Norman is kind of crazy. So to throw a kind of added layer on this, like, when we're thinking about Saint Maud in relation to other Catholic films and other Catholic horror films, I think one of the things that really stands out is the fact that it's written and directed by a woman, and centers women, and centers women in ways that run completely in the face of the way that women's bodies, not even like that women often aren't fully realized characters in Catholic horror, though there are some very recent films that have just hit the theaters that are challenging that. But so I mean, I guess the question is like, to what extent is this secular distancing or critique or whatever we would call it that kind of Rose Glass seems to be kind of injecting into this Catholic horror film, to what extent is that connected to it being a film directed and written by a woman? Would we call it a feminist film? Is this a feminist critique of kind of Catholic horror tropes? What do we think about that as a kind of line of thought for thinking about it?
Tony, do you have any thoughts on that? I do, but
Well, yeah, I think that's a useful way of thinking about, one way of thinking about the film, right? I mean, there is this, the self-mortification is very gendered here, right? And at times incredibly brutal, right? I mean, the scene, I think Alyssa is getting at this in her question about, the putting the tacks in the shoe. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think one way of seeing this is reading this is a kind of critique of this kind of gendered Catholic, what is at least often expected of women in their devotional practices and self-sacrifice. Yeah, I think that's there. It might not be the only thing there, but that's And seeing it again, that's what struck me.
I mean, I definitely, before letting you jump in, Katie, just like very quickly on that self-mortification bit, like if we think about Reagan in The Exorcist as like the kind of like archetype, like that's you know, a girl in the film who is having violence done to her by a kind of gendered male, kind of but ethereal supernatural figure, and she's not really an agent, nor is she even really the protagonist. Like the story is really largely about this like male priest, whereas Maud is like very much the agent of this story, though her kind of like her actions are self-mortifying, right? But Katie, what do you make of this?
Yeah, what do you make of that?
I mean, oh gosh, I don't know. I mean, it's obviously the lack of men in the film is something, right? I mean, there's really, I mean, it's a film about women, right? It's a film about women. I don't know. I mean, I don't know, Cressler, I don't know if you said this part out loud or we were just talking about it earlier, but whether that kind of secular distance is like part and parcel of a feminist critique, right?
Yeah.
And
well, that was an open question. I don't think either of us were like quite sure how we felt answering that.
Yeah, right. Because I mean, right. So if you go to The Exorcist, it's like that the sort of like reality of the supernatural there turns upon the way in which it plays out along gender lines, right?
Yeah.
And so the sort of thought then being, well, okay, if you're going to do a sort of critique of that does that critique then in turn sort of like distance oneself from the sort of reality of the supernatural? And I don't know. It made me think of this is just random trains of thought, right? It also made me think about Rosemary's Baby. And it made me think about like whether the sort of reality, whether the supernatural is really real in Rosemary's Baby. And I mean, I've read readings of Rosemary's Baby that say that it's kind of like a kind of feminist film, or it can be read as a sort of feminist film, right? Because it's about sort of men sort of taking control of women's bodies and all this. But I don't know. I don't have any more than that.
Yeah.
So,
I want to,
there's a question, Matt, Alyssa's question about, it's a really interesting question. So she writes, I was so interested in St. Maud represents 21st century self-mortification. The Converse sneakers with the thumbtacks was such a choice. Yeah, indeed. Any thoughts about how self-mortification is rendered modern or contemporary here, and how the film is calling us to understand it? Yeah, that's a...
you guys think about that. Alyssa, if you don't mind, I'm gonna experiment with inviting you to talk. I'm serving as both panelist and IT. You don't have to speak. You don't have to speak if you don't want, but I'm experimenting with giving you the capacity to speak.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. Can y'all hear me? Am I?
We can. Yeah, we can. Yeah.
Yes. It's a great question. So please elaborate.
And then I can call on other people as well in the future.
Wonderful. Well, I'm so delighted to be here via voice with y'all. I have you projected on my TV screen, so I'm having lots of fun seeing you. So today so I watched St. Maud yesterday. I did the homework just for this. But today in my Catholics class, I was teaching Alan Greer's Mohawk Saint. And he has these two really great chapters in there about Native women's self-mortification and flagellation practices. And he gestures towards a few different analyses of this, people sleeping on beds of thorns and whipping themselves and putting like burning coals between their toes. And of course, in class, I talked about St. Maud and the way it's represented, and the way it's represented in the film. But I found it really interesting the way we see her burn herself, and she's picking at that scab and that wound. Obviously, we see her walking with the tacks in her sneakers, and she's like traversing the world. She's going about the rest of her life. We see her in bars. We see her in all these contemporary settings undergoing this kind of suffering or having those marks on her body. And that is so different than these stories of in the distant past that we hear about saints, maybe in more closed contexts. So I was wondering, especially in terms of the kind of secular narrative that y'all are talking about with this film, how maybe Rose Glass is thinking about self-mortification and its place in contemporary women's devotion. So those are some of my thoughts, but all of this was coming very much alive for me in my class discussions today.
Can I jump in?
Yeah,
That's such a good question, Alyssa, and you totally made me think about the film a different way just by asking that question. And it makes me think about the fact that so much of the setting for this film is about 21st century British austerity. And I mean, I'm thinking about, right, because the premise of her situation is that she was in a hospital that was short-staffed on nurses, right? And she ended up accidentally killing a patient because she was overworked and she hadn't gotten enough sleep and she was short-staffed. And then I think about her going back as a nurse to that little tiny apartment that she lives in.
Yeah.
Right. And that's such a 21st century story about austerity and lack of resources that becomes the sort of like socioeconomic kind of like context within which her mortification emerges. So, and I had never thought about that until this moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think the self-mortification and that point about the kind of like modern, like the first time I saw it, what struck me about the movie was like this, oh my God, this is a movie about how horrifying it would be if older ways of being Catholic were teleported into the 21st century. Like that like self-mortification that are like part, you know, have long histories in the Catholic Church and in Catholic practice that are so foreign as to look insane and psychotic when translated into the 21st century in the way that Maud does. And so that this is like one of those things where I almost, you know, as with any movie these days, like you can read a dozen interviews with Rose Glass and she can tell you what she thinks the movie's about. And she made the film, so obviously she has a lot to say about it. But you know, and one of the things she's like, so one of her interviews, she's like, I don't think the film is really about religion. It's about, you know, like what happens when like a person who's kind of undergoing a kind of psychotic break, you know, like gets lost in a world and you know, she's not, you know, she says something, it's like she kind of Rose Glass talks about Maud kind of inventing her own kind of warped version of Christianity. And as a scholar of Catholics and Christianity, I'm like, well, she's not, it's not that warped in relation to things that we write about and read about in other time periods, to your point, Alyssa, about like teaching it in relation to like longer histories of self-mortification. And so for me, it's less, you know, kind of contra Rose Glass. It's like less about like, oh, it's not really about Christianity. It's more about like, well, what happens when you kind of take something from what seems to be another time and transport it to the present. And again, like that's kind of what Catholic horror likes to play in. It's like taking so-called older notions of the reality of the supernatural and transporting them into the 20th or the 21st century and scaring us. But in this case, it's like the valence is opposite, right? It's like, it's not a good thing. We're supposed to kind of like stand back in horror.
And Maud is a convert, right?
Yeah.
She's a convert to Catholicism, which is a little interesting too. This kind of attractions to these older forms of
but it's, yeah. But it's also to her point, to your point, Tony, right? I mean, she converts to Catholicism, but she never goes to church.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Right?
Very much a kind of her own thing.
Like a 21st century, talk about a 21st century take on self-mortification, right? I mean,
right.
I mean, not that, I mean, there's all sorts of like Christian mysticism that isn't super church-based, right? But really, I mean, this is like, she's in her 20s. She's a what generation is that? She's not even a millennial, right? Whatever you younger than millennial folks are.
Jesus,
right?
wow.
Gen Z, I get, right? You
Gen
know,
Z,
Yeah.
maybe, I don't know, but like church is not on her radar, right?
Yeah.
Church is
right.
not on, church is not, converting to Catholicism is, but church is not on her radar.
Yeah, right.
I want to invite Christina Pasqua, who wrote that incredible essay that we've referenced a
Yes.
few times. I want to invite her in the room because she has a great long question and also references one of the big influences on the film that I totally did not pick up on the first time I watched it. So Christina, I'm going to invite you into the room, and maybe if you want to either read the question you posted or kind of riff on it, it's really in line with this conversation we're having.
Hello.
Hey, Christina.
Hi,
Hi.
how are you?
Good.
Good.
Welcome.
Thanks for having me. This has been so great. Yeah, so I guess the question is more just speaking to the comment about, what would we think about the film had we not had that final, 10 seconds or something like that. And I think for me, the basis of that comment is coming from a place of, the director throughout the story is kind of giving us in small bite sizes the different versions of what's happening. And toward the end, you kind of come to this bigger realization of, oh no, this is what's happening outside of Maud's world. But I don't think it necessarily takes away from the reality of Maud's world, right? Like, she's an unreliable narrator, but I think there's something I think that's maybe where like the Catholic part of this is at play of, there's kind of a criticism of that way of looking at the world, like the old school Catholic tradition. But there's also a kind of self-awareness that this is how people see things in certain perspectives, worldviews, places in the world, historical time periods. So I think it's not necessarily delegitimating Maud so much as, showing that both things are happening simultaneously. She's burning to the people at the beach, but she is also having this very ecstatic, blissful end. So I don't know if the final scene is to suggest that Maud is actually, experiencing that pain, or if that's just what we're seeing from the outside, right? So that's kind of where my comment's coming from, and that's tied to Taxi Driver, which I think Rose Glass has talked about as a really important influence for this movie. Also, another Catholic
Yes,
making
that's right.
stories about, whose reality do we believe? So there's something happening here in the history of like what the kinds of stories that Catholic filmmakers are telling too, outside of the genre of horror, but just thinking about, psychology and reality and all that stuff. So
yeah,
right. That's a good point.
Thank you, Christina.
That's a really good point. That's a great point. Thank you.
That really, you unlocked from like rereading your essay to prepare for tonight, like you really unlocked that reading of the film for me, because I had kind of read that ending as like, well, that's, Rose Glass kind of closing the door on like how we're supposed to view this. But I'm really compelled by your reading that we actually, like, that may be the last image, but we have these two things that are kind of side by side, and kind of existing in tension. And the taxi driver bit, which I had just came across, like, I think Katie and I rewatched it. And then I, of course, dove down the rabbit hole of reading everything I could on it. And then I found the interview with Rose Glass where she's like, yeah, I think of Maud as Travis, if Travis Bickle was a young Catholic woman in the English seaside. And it's like, that like totally unlocked the film for me, because it's like, oh, wow, like that it fits to a T.
Yeah, so that's always been my reading, I think, from the beginning, but I love the different perspectives that you guys are taking to it, because I don't think it's clear cut. So thank you.
Thank you, Christina.
One question I wanted to kind of raise here, and be interested to hear what you guys, what you make of it, if anything or anybody. I was struck by the, as I mentioned in my comments, like, this movie has Sunset Boulevard on its mind, right? I mean, and the reference to Norma Desmond, and Amanda's house, right, has such a kind of 20s Art Deco like vibe, and it seems quite intentional, right? And so last night I rewatched Sunset Boulevard.
As we do.
Yes, right. And it's striking. So and also too, Amanda, right? At her party, right? She's dressed in a very kind of 20s style of outfit, almost looking a little like Norma Desmond. For those of you who haven't seen Sunset Boulevard, it's a film made in 1950 about Gloria Swanson plays an aging movie star from the 20s who has kind of ensconced herself in this fantasy world that she's still a star, and she gets William Holden, who kind of stumbles into this world to kind of, in a sense, be a caretaker. He's actually a script doctor, right? And so, but that movie too is about devotion and obsession in some ways, and in some ways, like Rose at the end, she's going down for her close-up at the beach, right? Just thinking about that movie, we're kind of outside the context of Catholic horror per se, or in terms of other Catholic horror movies, and kind of slice into it in a slightly different way. Did you notice the kind of references, this kind of evocation of the 20s in this house with the wallpaper, the furniture, the costuming seems so intentional, and I'm not quite sure what to make of it.
Yeah, I did, totally, Tony. I actually watched Sunset Boulevard unrelated like a month ago with my kids because they just like wanted to watch it. So I have been thinking about Sunset Boulevard randomly. But this is like a little bit of like a free association, right? But
I love it. Love free association.
So Sunset Boulevard, right, makes me think about Great Expectations, and makes me think about Miss Havisham, who's like sort of like sitting in her house, like attached to another time, right? Mm-hmm. And Miss Havisham makes me think about Mark Mass's article on Vatican II. Which is to say, because he has that essay on Vatican II, like on the first Sunday of Advent, right, where he talks about the sort of like church that had been locked in time, like Miss Havisham's house, right? Mm-hmm. But I think which all is to say that there's this way in which both Sunset Boulevard and Saint Maud sort of like play with time, sort of like captured, right?
Right.
Time sort of captured and held in place, right? And that then sits in an interesting way. In Saint Maud, that sits in an interesting way with the Catholicism that comes in.
Yeah,
right. Which
Good point.
Also a Catholicism that sort of is invoking something that is sort of captured and locked in place outside of time, right?
Yeah, right. In that sense, with that kind of iconography and devotionalism is very particular, right? That's a good point. Yeah.
I haven't seen Sunset Boulevard, sadly, so
what?
I know.
What?
I didn't need to say that. I didn't need to confess to everyone, but I did. I couldn't live with this guilt. I mean, just listening to you both talk about that brought me into what seems to be also a clearly intentional contrast between the world that Amanda occupied and occupies, and the kind of Catholicism or whatever we want to call what Maud's bringing in, that she's bringing in, right? So like it's not just that like she's hospice care for some random woman. I mean, like the fact that she is this kind of like high art kind of balletic performer who is both kind of like, I think that like the contrast we see is on one scale, like a kind of like, and someone referenced this, I think Brooke Tranton referenced this in the Q&A, like contrast between like Amanda's kind of seeming hedonism and self-indulgence versus Maud's kind of austerity and self-mortification. But it seems like a contrast between like the world of like high art and kind of like, cosmopolitanism. When Maud like catches that video clip of Amanda's performance, and it's like the kind of like most abstract kind of balletic kind of performance as one could imagine. The contrast there seems to be not just between like hedonism on the one hand and austerity on the other, but also this contrast between a kind of like what feels like a kind of working class like lived Catholicism and the kind of secular literati and cosmopolitanism of Amanda, right? So you have like the home altar in this tiny little dingy apartment that's like off an alley, and you have this like huge Gothic home with like posters of ballet and opera performances and bookshelves and you know kind of the kind of cosmopolitanism of embodied by Amanda that's dying, of course,
and her party, right?
And her part, yeah, yeah,
right, you know.
Yeah, the party that like, I mean, that I actually was really struck on rewatch of just the choreography of that moment when they kind of like grab Maud and dress her up as the savior. You know, for like it was a very brief moment, but like for a moment you get like an invocation of like the Passion of the Christ with like Jesus being kind of like mocked by the soldiers on his, in preparation for his death, right? So there's a kind of like, it's maybe like one of the only moments in the film, I don't know, I won't speak for everybody, but like for me, like one of the only moments where you feel sad for Maud, where you're like, oh, actually, Katie can attest, like as we were watching the movie together, I just kind of like was muttering as a mantra to myself, oh, poor sweet Maud, poor sweet Maud. Because particularly the first half, it's just like, it is funny. To your point, Tony, it's like, it's funny. It's just like, for the first half, you're just like, oh, this sweet, sad little self-mortifying girl who's like clearly misreading everyone around her. I mean, kind of like, I mean, a lot like Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver, where it's like, you're kind of like awkwardly watching someone like read the entire, the completely wrong thing about every situation that they find themselves in.
Right. Yeah, right. And you see that in the kitchen scene with Kara, right? And when she just doesn't kind of pick up, she says, what are you doing? She said, I'm leaving. She said, oh, okay.
Right.
Okay.
We have a few people who have raised questions. Adrienne has actually raised a few, and Brooke has raised a few. I wonder if I can just invite you into the room to share a little bit. I know this is a danger because you might not be like interested in talking, but Adrienne, I'm just going to invite you in, and you can feel free to not say anything if you're not interested in joining.
Hi. Yeah. So thanks for this. It's really, it's a fun event, and I enjoyed watching the film. I hadn't seen it before, but had my son had about it because he knows I'm interested in religion and film. So yeah, I mean, I don't think I'll rewatch it, to be honest. I think I'm good with one, and I think part of it is I felt like there was a way in which Maud's obsession with the dance, forgetting her name, Amanda, thank you, that was part of the psychosis. Like she really became unhealthily, dysfunctionally obsessed with her, and that contributed to the sort of what could have been kind of a good arc, where there was that moment where they prayed together, and I thought that was sweet and authentic. It felt authentic to me, and of course, not that, but just I think what the turning point for me was when Maud confronted, was it Carol or Amanda's
Carol, her lover,
and that was like, clearly Maud was jealous, and so rather than really, I mean, to me, that's how I read it, and so to me, rather than really being concerned for Amanda's spiritual health, she was more like, I want her for me. And so that then it started to sort of, whereas I had kind of seen this as having, I don't know. I mean, it just to me, that became like a Fatal Attraction kind of thing.
Yeah. I don't think you're wrong in reading it that way. I mean, as I was taking notes while we were watching it, or rewatching it, like the first time I saw it, I'm like very fixated on kind of this kind of like erotics of suffering and self-mortification, like that there's like an erotics and an intimacy and a sensuality to Maud's own mystical experiences, which, you know, is kind of connected to long histories of kind of, you know, mystical ecstasy. This time exactly what you were just saying, Adrienne, was struck not just by that, but also by the kind of erotics of conversion, like where there's like a kind of like that scene where they're praying together, you know, they're having this kind of like intimate moment, and it kind of cuts from them having this godgasm, as Glass called it, to her like helping to stretch her body, but in a way that like feels entirely different and feels like there's like clearly an attraction there. And Katie, I don't know if you wanted to jump in here to talk a little bit about, because you had also been struck by what was it? The victim, oh shoot.
Soul?
The victim soul. Yeah, like the way that Amanda kind of takes on this, tries this on for size, like basically, in this relationship, in this kind of like weirdly kind of sexual, not sexual relationship that they have, that I think is kind of connected to this like kind of question about like the way that you know, to your point, Adrienne, like for me, I don't see them as mutually exclusive. The question of like, is Maud jealous, and is she like invested in saving Amanda's soul? I think that like for Maud, like they're wrapped up, and I would, you know, maybe like dare to say that like those kinds of lines, kind of affective kind of motivations, are probably often, not probably, as a historian, I'd say, like are often wrapped up in like the processes of conversion and missionary work. Though I don't think that that's exactly what Rose Glass is after. What do you think about all this, Katie?
I guess only that I find it interesting that sincerity is like a really important register for Maud. You know, and it's not an important register. It's not an important register for Amanda. Right. And I think it's funny that we're sitting here as like Catholic scholars, like using sincerity as like our framing for talking about the Catholic one in the partnership. Right. And so I mean, I wonder, like, I'm thinking about Amanda like trying victim soul on for size, and like, you know, I mean, maybe Amanda's more Catholic than Maud is, like in some ways, you know.
Well, yeah, she does.
Like, I mean, who cares? I mean, she's, you know, who cares what her intent is? Like, she's suffering, you know.
Right. And she does write the book, right? You know, as you alluded to earlier, right? The
Body's a Stage,
Body's a Stage, right? I mean, that kind of like gives it away, right?
Yeah.
Right.
This is great.
Okay. All right. So let's see. Is Brooke still there with us?
Yeah, let me I'll invite Brooke
if
in.
If Brooke would like to
Brooke,
join.
here, I'm inviting you in because you asked that question about God, which we haven't talked about, the Welsh speaking cockroach god of the film. I don't know if you want to jump in, but we'd love to hear from you.
Sure. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, we can.
Wonderful.
Welcome. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, thanks for letting me to speak a little bit. Dr. Cressler, love your shirt. Favorite movie of all time. Love The Exorcist. Yes, so the weird Welsh speaking beetle god. One thing that particularly struck me about this film, so last night was the second time I watched it, and I gave it a good hard, you know, trying to pay attention to the lighting, dialogue, setting, everything. It seems to me that Glass almost gives away what she's trying to say about the religiosity or lack thereof with Maud. The first scene we see is Maud after, you know, whatever happened with that patient whom she accidentally killed, in some sort of facility where she's cut her wrists and she's staring at the beetle on the ceiling. And we see that beetle every now and again when Maud is sort of spiraling into her various crises after something with Amanda has gone wrong. So I guess upon viewing this in the second time, I'm seeing God whenever he does appear, or when we think he appears, as there's nothing consoling about him, right? It's always very negative, or at least the way we're seeing him through Maud's eyes, where she's going, oh, if this is how you treat your most devoted servants, I would hate to see how you treat the ones who don't serve you, after the incident with Amanda and all of that. So I guess I'm sort of viewing this as somebody whose religiosity or lack thereof is really experienced through just horrible mental illness. And I was tipped off by that also when in Maud's general characterization, you know, anytime something goes wrong in the film, she just flips on a dime. The sincerity thing you were talking about, she's equal parts cunning, but also very naive. You know, she couldn't see that Amanda was putting her on in the ecstatic experience, the prayer-gasm, what have you. So yeah, I guess those would be my general comments about the way God is characterized. And also the Welsh was a choice, and it reminded me very much of The Witch.
Yeah,
When
definitely.
you know, oh God, what was his name? The
Philip,
sheep.
Black
Black
Phillip,
Phillip
yeah.
goes, you know, would you like to live deliciously? And it's very interesting that Glass, I kind of think she might have been having a bit of fun with us there too, that God's voice is actually this sort of demonic Welsh, you know, tone. And then Maud responds in English. But yeah, anyways, those are some of my 2 cents there. Thank you.
Thank you, Brooke. I want to quote the great Christina Pasqua again, because like we keep referencing her piece, but in her piece she has this line where she says, the film offers viewers the possibility that divine rather than demonic presence can be the source of a film's terror. And so like Christina, I think rightly, is like pointing at, this is another kind of like inversion of the classic like Catholic horror trope, where it's like it's actually like the possession of Maud by God, or you know, whether or not we think it's actually God, or what it would even mean to be actually God, I don't know. But that idea that like no, it's not Pazuzu, it's not Satan, it's God that's got you, and like this is worse somehow. It's like, I think, really compelling. Yeah.
I just want to just jump in real quick, Cressler, on your comment. I've been thinking about what Christina was saying when she briefly joined us via audio, and it makes me think about what God horror feels like versus like what psychological horror feels like. Right? I mean, for us as the audience, right? If this is a horror film, right, and it's a horror film in Christina's reading that really keeps alive that kind of like tacking back and forth between, is this God, is this terror emerging from the divine, or is this terror emerging from a mind that has disintegrated?
Yeah.
Right. And thinking about like whether those two horrors feel similar, right? Whether for the audience those two horrors are scary in the same way, or whether they're scary in different ways, and whether a movie that manages to keep the tension between them alive whether that allows us to feel horror in a sort of more complicated way.
Yeah. Well, and I think at that point, Katie, gets to the heart of it, because I do think, I mean, and this is true of all film, right? But like so much of what the film is like what you bring to it, right? So I imagine that the Catholic studies peeps, are coming to this movie like Alyssa, like with the, talking about self-mortification and the colonial history of, Catholicism. And we see Catholicism everywhere. And this is a Catholic horror movie. I mean, like, I think that anybody on this call who's a historian or scholar of Catholicism, you're watching this movie and you are brought into Maud's apartment and you see that altar that she's crafted for herself with, a picture of the Divine Mercy and rosary beads and a crucifix and holy water and all of this stuff. You can't help but see like lived Catholicism, right? Like the ways that like people have lived, what it means and looks like and smells like and feels like to be Catholic. If you don't have any of that, this is a film about psychosis, probably, right? Like if you're totally like absent of all of this, this is yet another film about, oh my God, look what happens when like religious people go wild, right? Like and wild out, right? And that's what's interesting to me about like what Glass has said about the film, because she isn't, as I understand it, she's not Catholic, though she was educated in Catholic schools and has a kind of like deeply Catholic family. But she said like, well, I don't see this movie as, about religion per se. It's about this like kind of woman going through a psychotic breakdown and kind of warping Catholicism to fit her own needs. But I'm watching it as a scholar of Catholicism being like, well, whether or not you think it's about that, like you've clearly like had enough of an education in what this looks like and feels like to have like rendered it on screen in a way that it hasn't really been rendered on screen before. I mean, so we haven't really gotten into this, but so much of Catholic horror centers on institutional Catholicism, like centers on priests and women religious in convents and catacombs and churches doing their official things. This film is not about that, but that doesn't make it less Catholic. It just means that it's actually like inviting us into a different kind of Catholic horror than we've seen. Sorry, that became much more rambly than I intended, but like I think it has. There was this quote by Murfred Clark, who plays Saint Maud, where she sees the film as a film about psychosis, and she's like, thank God, actually, and she like corrects herself mid-interview and says, thank God, actually, thank the welfare state that, I've had the mental health care that I've needed so that I don't end up like Maud. But that's such like a telling slip, like, because like that's so tells you so much about like how Clark and Glass and people making the film kind of understand the world. Whereas I think, people who are saturated in a particular kind of Catholicism are going to like resonate on a very intuitive level on like what this looks like and feels like.
Yeah, right. But what's so interesting, right, is the ways that these kind of Catholic references can kind of circulate in many different ways. And it's just really interesting to think about these, like in 2019, whatever Rose Glass wants to do or intends, like, they're there to be used, to be productive, right? And that's pretty interesting. We have one last question. I know we're kind of running late, but Emily, I don't know if Emily's still with us.
I'm inviting you into the room, Emily, but feel free if you don't want to unmute. That's okay.
Oh gosh. Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Yes. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah. No, thank you. This has been really fun. So, this is a horror movie, and of course there are so many parts of it that made me, physically uncomfortable, the self-mortification. But I think one of the most painful parts of the film to watch was when Maud, seems to lose her faith. She goes out and gets into these old patterns, right? We know that she's like a frequent barfly. She picks up this guy. She has this, sexual encounter that starts out consensual and then takes a turn where it's clearly become rape. And I don't know, it was definitely half-baked thought, but thinking about, how Maud is experiencing the so-called secular world, where she's going out to engage in what could be pleasurable, right? Having drinks, seeing friends, having a sexual encounter, and instead it twists, right? She's alienated. She can't connect to this group of people. She gets so drunk that we've got this great hallway scene where she's just barely seeing straight, barely upright, and then of course is a victim of sexual assault. So is this meant to be some sort of secular parallel to the kinds of wounds that she's inflicting upon herself in a religious context? I don't know, just thinking, but thanks for putting this together. This is really, really fun.
You're welcome.
Yeah,
thank you. Great observation. That's a great observation.
Yeah. Does anybody want to take that?
Cressler, you want? I'm going to toss it to Cressler because we were talking about Cressler and I when we watched the movie film the other night. We're talking about how horrible those scenes are.
Yeah.
So I don't know, Cressler, do you want to?
Yeah. How? Yeah. The tonal shifts in that scene or that whole part are really tough. And yeah, for me, like the thing that jumped out to me, which isn't to, it's just to kind of like add to your thoughts, Emily, taking it in I guess, just to build onto it is I was struck in watching it that like, those are really the only scenes with men in the whole film.
And they're so unerotic, right?
Yeah, yes, they're so and that was why the tonal shifts, like there's the like hand job in the hallway of the bar,
that, of course.
which is like funny in a bad way. Like it's just like so clearly like sexless, or not sexless is the wrong word, but like unerotic. I mean, it's just like such a contrast to, you have like the first like 45 minutes of the film where like the sexiest scenes are this hospice care nurse and the woman that she's like tending in her dying days, like stretching and like praying and having godgasms. And then the first time you see men really, and I didn't kind of like take too close notes on this, but I think basically the first time you see a man is like in the bar after she's been fired. And you have this like really just uncomfortable scene in the hallway, and then the like really disturbing scene back in whatever apartment it is. And then I think God's voice shows back up, and God is of course like the voice of this kind of like Welsh cockroach man or whatever. And so that was what struck me, was the kind of contrast, not just in terms of kind of like the secular world versus the kind of religious world that Maud's living in, but also this kind of like world where she's like experiencing the violence of men, in contrast to the self-mortification, the ascetic practices of purification that she's engaging in her religious life. Yeah, it's like it's like the halfway point in the film. So it's like it's almost like an intermission almost from this like weird kind of religious journey she's on.
And those scenes, if I recall, are shot, the lighting is very different. It's garish, it's harsh. Unlike, I think Adrian used the word, the earlier part of the films, like in Amanda's house, sumptuous and the luscious in terms of the cinematography in this movie is just remarkable. And I think it is so crucial to the kind of ways it generates its meanings. But those scenes, are hard to watch in many ways. And I think they're affected by a very different shift in the way the film is being, the cinematography and the elements of film are being used there.
One of the things, just to briefly add, that Rose Glass notes in an interview that I read, again, I read like a dozen interviews with her, but one of the things she notes is that for her, I think it was important for those scenes to indicate that it wasn't, that those scenes were in some ways to like ward off a reading of the film where Maud is just this kind of like naive girl who hasn't lived in the world at all. That like that it was like a way of saying like, no, Kate, it's not that like Maud has like adopted this life of religious austerity because she's somehow been protected from like partying and having friends and, having a sexual life and like these things, but that her in that brief moment kind of falling back into old patterns, and kind of the references to her like having been a partier and having been like someone who kind of lived that life was like a way of the film saying that like she's chosen to walk a different, like that kind of her choice to be Maud and to reject kind of Katie has been like a conscious effort on her part to kind of leave behind one way of being in the world and adopting another. Yeah.
Well, we're almost we're at 8:20. I don't see any other questions in the Q&A or chat. Does anybody have any other comments before we end? So, well, if not, then I want to thank everyone for joining us. I want to, in particular, thank Matt for doing the IT work, as well as contributing to this discussion. I learned a lot. Loved hearing from everyone. So Matt, thank you. Katie, thank you so much for being part of this first episode. And everyone who joined us, thank you very much. Thanks for sticking with us. I should say before we go, just a reminder that the next episode of Catholicism Around the Movies will be September 19th, early in the fall semester, and Monica Mercado would join us. And the movie will be Lady Bird. So look forward to watching Lady Bird, and then we'll have an evening talking about that movie. So until then, thank you, everybody. And this has been a great way to start this new initiative. Thanks again. Have a good night.
Thanks so much, Joe.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys. I'm going to hit end.
All right, Matt. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And I'm going to hit end, and it should, I think, bounce the video to ACHA's cloud.
Okay, let's hope.
Well, actually, let me maybe stop recording.